History is rarely made during business hours. It is forged in the dead of night, while the world is looking the other way. At 2:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 9, 2026, while the vast majority of the American public lay asleep, the global financial architecture was fundamentally dismantled. Just hours before the United States Congress was scheduled to convene for an unprecedented emergency Sunday session to override President Trump's trade policies, the Bank of Canada executed what analysts are now calling the most aggressive currency intervention in the history of modern central banking. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem, acting under direct emergency orders from Prime Minister Mark Carney's office, announced a multi-pronged monetary strike. Its goal was singular: the weaponization of the Canadian dollar to terminate 80 years of US dollar hegemony. Mark Carney did not choose 2:34 a.m. by accident. He timed the strike to hit while U.S. markets were dark, and while Asian and European exchanges were just beginning their high-volume windows. He wanted these measures in effect before a single American trader could reach their desk, and before the legislative machinery in Washington could pass a single override. By the time the president was woken up, the Canadian dollar, the loonie, was no longer just a currency. It had become a precision-guided munition aimed directly at the heart of the U.S. Treasury. The Carney Doctrine is not a single policy. It is a three-pronged execution of the current global reserve system. To understand why this is a kill switch, we must analyze each dagger individually. The first dagger: the currency basket peg. Historically, the Canadian dollar has functioned as a shadow currency of the U.S. greenback. Because 75% of Canadian trade was tied to the United States, the two currencies were tethered by a strong positive correlation. When the dollar moved, Canada followed. This morning, Carney severed that umbilical cord. Canada has officially pegged the loonie to a diversified basket of global currencies: 30% euro, 25% British pound, 20% Japanese yen, 15% Chinese yuan, and 10% Swiss franc. Notice the weight of the U.S. dollar: 0%. By delinking from the dollar, Canada has effectively insulated itself from American economic chaos. If the U.S. economy enters a hyperinflationary death spiral, the Canadian dollar will remain buoyant, anchored to the stability of the Eurozone and Asia. For global central banks looking for a safe haven, the Canadian dollar just became the most attractive asset on the planet. The second dagger: the execution of the petrodollar. Since the mid-1970s, the petrodollar system has been the bedrock of American power. This arrangement, where global energy is priced and settled exclusively in U.S. dollars, forced every nation on Earth to hold greenbacks in reserve. It allowed the United States to run massive trade deficits and sustain a gargantuan national debt without facing a currency collapse. Canada just ended that era. As of 2:34 a.m., all Canadian energy exports, oil, natural gas, and electricity, must be paid for in Canadian dollars, euros, or yuan. The U.S. dollar is now explicitly prohibited in these transactions. This is a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. By requiring CAD or euro for oil, Canada is forcing American refineries to sell their own dollars to buy foreign currency. This doesn't just reduce demand for the dollar. It creates a permanent, structural downward pressure on its value. Canada has effectively taxed the shovel of the American economy. The third dagger: the Democratic Trade Alliance, DTA Reserve Shift. Perhaps the most lethal move was the coordination with the 40 nations of the Democratic Trade Alliance. Canada announced that all 40 member nations have agreed to hold the Canadian dollar as an official reserve asset and to accept it for trade settlement among themselves. This represents $58 trillion in annual economic activity that is now actively migrating away from the U.S. financial system. Central banks from London to Tokyo are now dumping U.S. Treasuries to acquire CAD. Canada is not just leaving the dollar. They are leading the world to the exit ramp. The verdict from the global markets was instantaneous and brutal. Because Asian markets open while America is still in darkness, we saw the systemic rupture happen in real time. In the trading pits of Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the US dollar suffered a historic 4% collapse against the yen and the yuan within the first 90 minutes of the Canadian announcement. Traders moved on to a single, cold realization. If the world no longer needs greenbacks to buy North American energy, the US dollar is fundamentally overvalued by at least 25 to 30%. By the time European markets opened at 3 a.m. EST, the bleeding had turned into a hemorrhage. The US dollar dropped 4.1% against the euro and 3.8% against the British pound. But the real shock came from the institutions themselves. The European Central Bank, ECB, and the Bank of England issued unprecedented statements welcoming the diversification of global reserves. This is the ultimate geopolitical betrayal. America's oldest and most reliable allies are now openly endorsing the end of the dollar's reign. They aren't just watching the dollar fall, they are providing the liquidity to make it happen. Meanwhile, gold has spiked by $2,847, while Bitcoin has surged 31% to trade above $94,000. The world is not just speculating, it is fleeing. Capital is deserting the dollar for any asset with intrinsic, resource-backed, or decentralized value. While the currency markets are the front line, the physical reality at the border is what economists are calling the arterial embolism. The North American trade system is a high-velocity circulatory system. It is built on just-in-time logistics, where components cross the border multiple lun before a single product is finished. At 2:34 a.m., the blood flow stopped. Customs agents at the Ambassador Bridge and the Peace Bridge were issued new directives. Every shipment originating from or destined for the United States must undergo full manual security inspections. The trusted trader status has been revoked. When you add just 10 minutes of manual inspection to 10,000 trucks, you don't create a delay. You create a permanent, compounding blockage. By 6 a.m., a 20-mile queue of idling trucks stretched along the 49th parallel. Drivers sat in their cabs, watching the value of their cargo evaporate as the US dollar plummeted. This is the physics of a collapse. When the parts stop moving, the factories seize. In Michigan and Ohio, auto plants that depend on Canadian-made transmissions and steel began the process of hot shutdowns, canceling shifts indefinitely as they realized the just-in-time oxygen had been cut off. Inside the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, the atmosphere at 3:15 a.m. was one of primal, unmanaged panic. The Treasury Secretary was briefed on the Asian collapse and immediately convened an emergency conference call with the Fed. The consensus was grim. The United States has no good moves left. To support the dollar, the Fed would need to use its foreign exchange reserves, but U.S. reserves are a drop in the ocean compared to the $58 trillion economic weight of the DTA. If the Fed raises interest rates to attract investors back to the dollar, they will crush the already fragile U.S. housing market and bankrupt thousands of American businesses. Washington is in a strategic checkmate. At FIRA, 0 a.m., the National Security Council held an emergency virtual meeting. According to high-level sources, officials discussed whether Canada's intervention constituted economic warfare that could justify a military response. The Pentagon's briefing was a bucket of cold water. Any military move against Canada would trigger NATO's Article 5 against the United States. For the first time in history, the U.S. military, the world's most powerful force, is legally and strategically sidelined in a conflict taking place on its own doorstep. When President Trump was finally briefed at 5:30 a.m., he was reportedly told that the reserve status of the dollar, the very foundation of the American standard of living, is on life support. Without it, the United States loses its ability to print money to pay for its debts. The country would face forced austerity, massive spending cuts, and an economic contraction that would make the 2008 crisis look like a minor market fluctuation. At 8:30 a.m., the third leg of the North American trade stool officially broke. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum announced that Mexico is joining Canada's currency basket system. Furthermore, Mexico will now require payment in non-dollar currencies for its energy and manufactured exports to any nation outside of the USMCA. This is the total isolation of the United States. Mexico and Canada, the two largest trading partners of the U.S., have officially built a monetary wall around the greenback. The era of dollar dominance through coercion is over. Mexico has signaled to the global South that it is safer to align with a resource-backed Canadian dollar and an alliance of 40 nations than to stay tethered to a debt-backed U.S. system. The Monroe Doctrine, which for 200 years asserted American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, has been shattered not by a foreign invasion, but by a coordinated economic divorce. The real threat to Washington tonight is not coming from foreign capitals. It is coming from the American boardroom. At 8:45 p.m., as the reality of the Monday morning market opening looms, an emergency conference call was held between the CEOs of the Fortune 500, including Walmart, Amazon, Ford, and ExxonMobil. Their message to Capitol Hill is blunt. The American economy cannot survive another 24 hours of this. These corporations manage the literal lifeblood of the nation. Their supply chains are shattered, their logistics costs have doubled overnight, and their global competitiveness has been incinerated. They have issued an ultimatum. If Congress does not override the President and accept Canada's demands by midnight Sunday, they will begin announcing mass layoffs the second the markets open tomorrow. We are talking about the potential for over 1 million American jobs to be deleted in a single day. The Monday massacre is no longer a fear. It is a corporate strategy. Corporate America has effectively joined the Canadian mutiny. As the clock ticks toward the historic 12 p.m. congressional vote, we are staring at three potential endgames for the American experiment. Scenario 1. Systemic capitulation. The override succeeds with a massive bipartisan majority. Congress accepts all 5 of Canada's demands by this evening. The U.S. officially surrenders its trade position to save the dollar. Canada announces a pause on the currency peg and energy requirements. The markets stabilize, but the damage is permanent. The world has seen that the dollar's reserve status is a fragile illusion that can be broken by a determined neighbor. Scenario 2. The hyperinflationary spiral. The override fails due to political infighting or extreme pressure from the White House. Canada moves to full implementation. By Monday morning, global central banks begin a fire sale of U.S. Treasuries. The dollar loses 25% of its value in a single week. Import prices double, grocery stores are emptied, and the United States enters a hyperinflationary depression. Scenario 3. The constitutional rupture. The president, seeing the market bloodbath, invokes the Insurrection Act or declares a national emergency to seize Canadian assets by force. This triggers an immediate constitutional crisis. Northern governors in states like Washington and Michigan, whose economies are functionally annexed to Canada, refuse to follow federal orders. The United States fractures from within while the economy burns. For 80 years, the U.S. dollar was the undisputed king of the world. It allowed America to borrow, spend, and lead without limit. But that status was never a law of nature. It was a contract based on the assumption that the United States was a stable, reliable, and rational partner. Canada has just challenged that assumption on a global stage. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland made the position clear this morning. The world needs reserve currencies backed by countries that respect international law and treat their partners with dignity. By pegging to a basket and killing the petrodollar, Canada hasn't just defended its own interests, it has offered the world an exit ramp from the American system. The clock is ticking toward the noon vote. Global markets have already cast their ballot, and they have voted against the greenback. Washington has hours, not days, to decide if it wants to save the dollar or watch the North American island descend into economic darkness. The era of the dollar is on life support, and the kill switch is in Ottawa. The world is needing its breath. The markets are moving, and the outcome will determine the fate of the American century.